Welcome to Being Human. I'm your host, Steve Cuss. On Being Human, we take a look at all of the dynamics that infect your well-being and your relationships. We look at how they infect your human relationships when we get irritable with each other, when we judge each other, but also your relationship with God. It turns out that the same dynamics that infect your human relationships can also get in the way of your awareness of God. And we also look at how you get disconnected from yourself. So these are your core relationships. And what we have discovered is that reactivity, judgmentalism, irritability, triggers, things like this, they one of the first things they do is take away our awareness of God. So every week on the show, we relax into God's presence by lighting a candle. So let's do that now. And just as we light this candle, just an invitation for you to intentionally relax into God's presence. One thing that might be helpful for you is just to think about something that you're holding that you know God is calling you to hand over, something you've got a tight grip on, that you're trying to control, that you shouldn't be trying to control. God's inviting you to trust God with it. Or maybe it's not that you have a tight grip. Maybe something has a tight grip on you. I think we've all been there. You're at the end of your rope, and just a chance now to remember you're not alone. Because one of the things that anxiety does is it tries to tell you you're all alone. And so just this candle helps us remember God's with us. Okay, I think this is a brief episode today. I want to have a conversation with us about 4 dynamics. This is kind of a solo episode on some tools that I teach when people come in for intensives or if they bring me in to do a workshop, things like this. 4 dynamics that affect and infect our faith. The first dynamic is faith. We're going to talk about faith today. Doubt and the relationship between faith and doubt. The third dynamic is knowledge, faith, doubt, and knowledge. And the fourth dynamic is assumption. In my own faith journey, I was not raised in the church. I became a Christian as a teenager in a youth group. Shout out to the old Wembley Church of Christ in Western Australia. And, I went from a youth group faith to a Bible college faith. By the way, I would just say I think very fondly of both of those experiences. I look back very fondly with incredible gratitude to my youth group experience, also my Bible college experience. But if I had to summarize those 2 experiences, I think I would say that they were untested, and also I was pretty young, and they were a little bit sequestered. I tended to be around, a heavy Christian community. From Bible college, I went right into trauma chaplaincy, and that was when I ran headlong into doubt. So we have faith, we have doubt, we have knowledge. For me, I don't know if you've been on this journey. What it's commonly called nowadays is deconstruction. It's kind of funny because sometimes I feel like a bit of a grandpa because I deconstructed like in the mid-90s. Like that's early. Of course, the people that helped me through deconstruction, Philip Yancey, Frederick Buechner, Madeleine L'Engle, some of these amazing authors, they were deconstructing in the 70s and 80s. So I guess in some ways they're the modern great-grandparents of deconstruction. But I'd never really struggled with doubt before. Faith came pretty easily to me up until I was a chaplain. I was a young Christian. I was young in human years and young in my faith. So my faith was pretty certain. I kind of had that honeymoon phase, but the onslaught of suffering and death and the onslaught of people begging me to beg God for miracles and me being confused by my coping mechanism of people pleasing and my faith in God all kind of being mixed up. So, for example, if God didn't answer their prayer, then I felt like I'd let them down, I really had to grapple with the challenge of a loving God and an involved God and human suffering. And it was a very intense year. After my chaplaincy, I went to a seminary. I did a Master's of Divinity. And the theological education was amazing, but it was also really rigorous. And they exposed us to all kinds of theology, conservative theology, very progressive theology, everything in between. And I think for me, the double hit of the onslaught of death and suffering in chaplaincy and the academic exposure to theology that challenged a lot of what I thought I knew, it really sent me on a doubt journey. And I feel like in many ways I owe my faith to Philip Yancey, Frederick Buechner, Madeline L'Engle, Elizabeth Ochtemeyer. I'd be happy to give you a list. I've got a number of authors and humans that really helped me through that time. Maybe those authors aren't familiar to you, but boy, they are people that help you when you feel like your faith is dark. You feel like the foundation of what you believe has been taken away, pulled from you. You know, Jesus talks about the importance of building your house on the rock. And he warns us not to build our house on the sand. And I just always think, well, I didn't know I was building my house on the sand. Like no one intentionally means to build their house on the sand. And so it felt to me like the foundation of my faith was being pulled out from under me and I was kind of in a free fall. It's terrifying. So here's the first thing I want to introduce for us. I used to think before this experience, I used to think that doubt was the opposite of faith, but knowledge is the opposite of faith. Doubt is a close cousin to faith. Technically, I think doubt is faith's first cousin, a very close relative. Faith and doubt have a very close link. It's knowledge and faith that are on opposite spectrums. I'll explain that in a little bit, but if you open your Bibles, you see, especially through the New Testament, there's tremendous room and gentleness to people who doubt. In Matthew 28, when Jesus gives the Great Commission and that kind of charge that he gives to the disciples where he says, therefore go into all of the world and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And then Jesus says, and lo, I'll be with you always. It's an amazing statement. A lot of preachers and sermons have really called that. But right before that, I love what Matthew records. If you open your Bible to Matthew 28, right before that clarion call, Matthew records that everyone worshiped and some doubted. So out of all the disciples, if everybody worshiped, then there's a subset of doubters. That's amazing, isn't it? That they are in the presence of Jesus and they still doubt, and clearly there's room for them to doubt. I also love Jude, the New Testament book Jude. It's just one chapter long. So Jude 22, Jude says, be merciful to those who doubt. I love that because Jude was Jesus' brother. And the Gospels clearly record that Jesus' family doubted. They weren't sure what to make of everything Jesus was doing and everything that was being said about him. And clearly, after the resurrection, Jude figured it out, right? And he wrote his book. But he made room for doubt. And I think that's really important. So what we have here is faith, doubt, and knowledge. And so what I want to introduce is the simple idea that there are some things in our belief about God that take no faith at all. Those are things that we know. If you know something, you don't have to, it doesn't take faith, you just know it. And what gets challenging is in our Christian communities, everyone has different amounts of faith in different parts of the teaching, right? Like for some people, believing that there is a God at all takes no faith for them. They know it. Now, I understand you can't prove it. You cannot prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is a God. I'm not getting into that. I'm just saying that for some people, it takes no faith for them to believe there is a God. They know it. But for some people in our church communities, it takes a lot of faith to even believe there's a God at all. Okay? For other people, okay, maybe they know there's a God, but is God involved? That takes faith. They're not sure that God is very involved. It's almost like they're closet deists. My point is this. There are a number of teachings about Jesus and God in the Christian faith, but we don't all approach all of those teachings with the same amount of faith or the same amount of knowledge. And I think for those of us who are Christian leaders like myself, we would do well to make room in our congregations for all kinds of faith, doubt, and knowledge, understanding that in all of our life journey with God, we are going to move from one to the other to the other. Some people knowing there's a God, some people it takes faith. Some people knowing there's a heaven, some people it takes faith. Like there are some people, if they're really honest, they would say to themselves, I'm really not sure that there's anything after this life. I'm just really not sure about that. I want to believe it. Lord, help my unbelief. And that's where you see faith and doubt having its relationship. So, just a couple of things here. What do you know for sure? What do you know for sure? Sometimes this is easier to reflect in your human relationships. Like, I'll talk about, my wife, Lisa, who often joins me on this show. It takes no faith for me to believe that she loves me. I know it. I know it. I don't have to place my faith in that love. I just know it. It takes no faith for me to believe my dog loves me. He just rushes up to me all the time. But for example, in my field, I am still relatively new in not being a local pastor and traveling and speaking and helping people in this work. I'm only 3 years into this. It takes faith to believe that God will provide next year. That takes faith. I don't know it. And that's complicated for me because I don't believe God owes me a living, for example. But also my own faith journey has a complicated relationship with God's providence. So faith is very personal. What you and I put our faith in and the amount of faith it takes is different for each of us. It's different for each part of our life. So there will be eras of your life where it takes no faith at all to believe something, and then eras of your life where, for example, a young college kid at a Bible college, it's like it feels so easy to access God's presence when you're in that environment. And then you leave college and you start your work, and God's presence can feel more elusive to you, and you can be tempted to think there's something wrong with you. Maybe you're not faithful enough. When in fact, it's actually just a fairly typical experience for humans as they get older, as they leave that kind of closer community. I know I'm speaking to a specific population, but you can probably insert your own story in this example. Well, now it takes more faith to believe something that it took no faith at all before to believe in. That's okay. That's okay. That's all part of our growth in God. What this is all about is trying to relax into God's presence, where sometimes you feel it and sometimes you do it by faith. And in case you're worried that maybe that's a shell game, what I've discovered in my own life is I have a choice many times a day. Where am I going to put my faith? In God or in myself? Both of them take faith, but one is generally good news and one is not so good news. Okay, so what about your Christianity takes faith for you? What do you doubt? What do you know for sure? That's just a helpful thing to try to flesh out. And for those of us who are faith leaders, particularly if we're preachers and we do teaching and communication and speaking, I'm going to ask you to maybe share some of your own journey on what takes faith, what you know for sure, what you doubt, and then how that's ebbed and flowed over the years. The goal is to create a space for your congregation or your people who are listening to be able to have permission to be honest. Rather than being embarrassed about faith, knowledge, and doubt, they can bring it all out into discussion, because the one thing doubt needs is fresh air, blue sky. Doubt doesn't do well when it's been kept in a lockbox in secret. Doubt does best when it's brought out into the open. That's why I highly encourage people who are deconstructing to try as best they can to deconstruct in a faith community. And I know for some people, the faith community is the reason you're deconstructing. So I want to be sensitive to those of you who have been wounded by the church. I too have been wounded by the church. I don't know any Christian that hasn't had some wounding story. That's just that's just part of the situation. I wish it wasn't, but still, finding a faith community where you can bring your doubt into the open and share it with each other, and then hold each other's doubt, that can be so beneficial. That can be so helpful. Okay, this fourth category and our final category, assumption. Assumption. My field, obviously, I'm a pastor, but what I spend most of my time doing nowadays is helping people improve their core relationships, their relationship with God, their relationship mostly in the workplace. I mostly go to organizations and conferences, and I teach how to manage leadership anxiety, how to notice anxiety coming at you from others and coming up from you. And if I had to summarize what I do in two things is I notice assumptions and I notice stuck patterns. Assumptions and stuck patterns. And assumptions are really hard to notice. I think that's why we hold them is they're really hard to notice. It's hard to know what you assume. But the fact is the human brain needs to have certainty to relax. That's where that third category of knowledge comes in. In order for the human brain to really rest, it wants to be certain. That way your safety radar can go down. And that's why you see, particularly on social media, so many bombastic people putting each other in their place. You must have seen on social media when somebody posts something provocative, particularly if it's political, some political provocative statement, and then you see all the comments just devolving into chaos and name calling and exaggeration. And when I read those experiences, what I see is assumption, assumption, assumption. Assumptions are contagious. We catch and spread them to each other. But what's going on is the human brain wants to move into a rigid posture of certainty. It's like, I have to be right so I can relax. I have to have the last word so I can relax. It's really quite sick. It's part of the human condition. And so what happens sometimes is we get faith, certainty, and assumption all mixed up. And the thing we think we know for sure, we actually are operating out of an assumption. One of the simplest assumptions that you can locate in your own life is your judgments. What kinds of people do you judge? Usually when you judge someone, well, first of all, you cannot connect to another human being and judge them at the same time. You cannot connect to another human being and judge them. It's one or the other. But we're all judgmental people. I'm a judgmental person. So one exercise you can try is make a list of the kinds of people and the kinds of behaviors you judge. And what you're looking for is you write those down. It's quite horrific to do this exercise. If you wrote down the kinds of people, the kinds of behavior you judge, start listing the assumptions you are making about those people. We make meaning out of their behavior. We make moral meaning. And the reason we don't notice God when we judge is because in the universe, God is the judge. But when we take God's place and we judge, we've now lost awareness of God. We are on the judge seat. We're on the jury seat for some of us. We're on the executioner seat. And we're making moral value out of other people's behavior. And that's an assumption. But the thing is, we think we know for sure what is right and what is wrong. So it's really important to introduce curiosity. Curiosity is what keeps assumption from calcifying and turning into certainty. Curiosity is one of the tools that really helps us stay connected to ourselves and to each other. Uh, what I try to practice is I've not been successful at becoming a non-judgmental person. I'm still a judgmental person, but what I've tried to do is not let my judgmentalism get the last word. So I notice myself being judgmental, and then I try to step over my judgmentalism and relax back into God's presence so that I can connect to the person I'm judging. I actually think this is a hallmark of Jesus. Jesus, I mean, the person who could judge anyone, we see in John chapter 8, for example, where he actually stands with a woman caught in adultery and basically says to her, "Woman, who condemns you?" Or in our language today, "Who judges you?" And she says, "No one, sir." All the Pharisees by then had left. "No one," she says. It's just her and Jesus standing there. Jesus, who is the judge of the universe, then turning to her and saying, "Then neither do I judge you." One of the great hallmarks of Jesus is he had values. Usually, we judge people when they violate our values. So if you're having trouble figuring out the kinds of behavior you judge, Maybe you can locate your core values. And the way you know your core value is your overreaction when someone violates it. Well, Jesus had core values. He was a Jewish rabbi. He had a very strict sense of right and wrong. There was no ambiguity in rabbinical teaching on what is right and moral law and moral code and all the Old Testament laws, 613 Old Testament laws. Jesus was into all of that. But one of the hallmarks of Jesus is he never let his judgment and his values get in the way of loving the people who are breaking them. A hallmark of Jesus, he loved the people who were breaking his values more than he loved his values. And I think this is something that we could really use nowadays because I find so many Christians judging each other. And when we do that, we are making meaning out of someone else's behavior. We are not connecting to them. We're not connecting to God. We're operating out of assumption. And because the human brain wants certainty to rest, our assumption in our mind turns to certainty. And now we're not living by faith anymore. So the goal, and this is not easy to do, is to die to our assumptions so we can grow in our faith. A final word on this, and I hope this has been helpful because I know it's kind of conceptual. A final word on this, Jesus said, you can know truth and truth can set you free. And I think when we first think about that, we think about salvation and eternal life. I actually think Jesus was giving us a bedrock truth about humanity, which is that humans had the capacity to know what is true, or another way to say it, to live in reality. Humans can live in reality, but assumptions put us in a false reality. And anytime we're in a false reality, we're bound. We're not at peace. We don't have shalom. We're disconnected. But anytime we are in actual concrete reality, we're free. Because concrete reality is where God lives, where God manifests, where God displays himself. So truth and concrete reality, we get to those through faith and through knowledge, and actually, interestingly, sometimes through doubt. My hero, Frederick Buechner, he says that doubt is the ants in the pants of faith. It keeps it alive and moving. So it's faith, doubt, and knowledge. These are the tools of our relationship with God. But it's assumption, the evidence of human fall, assumption that gets us into trouble. So learning to notice assumptions, learning to test our assumptions becomes a conduit or an avenue on how we can grow in our faith. Okay, we kind of covered a lot of ground there. So just in conclusion, what about your walk with Christ do you know for sure? What takes faith to believe? What about it do you doubt? Really, really hard to believe. And then who are your people where you can share that? If you're a communicator, how can you create a posture to give permission for your people to share that, give them some relief? Because doubt really needs to be shared. And finally, noticing assumptions, noticing when you have moved into assumption and now you're bound and disconnected from God's presence or awareness of God's presence. And then learning to die to your assumptions so that you can be curious and instead live by faith, doubt, and knowledge. Hope that helps. Just a final word. We have all kinds of episodes coming up on being human that we're really excited about. And you can really help us out by leaving a rating either on Spotify or iTunes or wherever you subscribe. Or would you consider leaving a written review? That really helps us. And maybe you'd even be willing to recommend an episode. If this episode was helpful, are there 2 or 3 people that you might be willing to share it with? We love to get the word out and have you help us spread the word. I have a weekly newsletter where we send you an article every week, and the link to that will be in the show notes. And the beauty is that our podcast is part of that article. So every week you get a reminder of a new episode. You just have to click the link to listen to it. Thanks so much for joining us on Being Human. Look forward to seeing you next time.